So for this session today, we have a hot topic. I'm a partner with a CPA firm up in Seattle, and every single client we're talking with about IT security, cybersecurity, it's a hot topic. Based on the full room here, I know all of you are interested in as well. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this session. First, we have Karen Schuler, who's the Data and Information Governance Practice Leader with BDO USA in Virginia. And then with Karen, we have Ricardo Trujillo, who's Senior Manager with Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman here in Maryland, both heading up IT areas, IT security areas in their respective firms. Excellent speakers on this topic, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. So without that, I'm going to turn over to Karen and Ricardo, and we'll take it away.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Wow, full house.
Yeah.
There's room up front. Nobody likes to come up front.
Yeah. There's plenty of tables.
No, but there really is. There's some space up here. So good morning, and thanks for joining us. As Andrew mentioned, we have a bit of a hot topic. So we figured we'd kick it off with an overview of some of the threats we're seeing, some of the threats that your organizations are probably experiencing, and then move into managing risks and then planning to respond. And we think we have some good, actionable information for you to take back to your organizations. One question I always have is, just by a show of hands, finance-related job? Okay, so mostly IT. Oh, we have our one
IT.
heckler in the... You're both. You're finance and...
All
well,
right.
A lot of you have been crossing over. Any legal?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Good. We can tell you anything around the technology.
We can say anything.
Just kidding. So threats today. So, one of the things, and I don't know if any of you read the FBI report that's out there it's the nation's state report. They always report on the amount of threats and where they're occurring, and what we're still seeing is that a great number of threats to organizations in general are insider related. And, either half of them are intentional or half of them are accidental. So it's still a pretty common theme, and one of the areas that we've talked quite a bit about, and I feel like I actually dream about this at night sometimes, is the threat of a data breach. And while the not-for-profit sector has been, I don't want to say immune to it, you have not had, outside of healthcare, you haven't had major breaches like Targets and Sony and so on and so forth. But one of the things we did want to emphasize is the fact that it's costly, regardless of the volume or the size of a data breach. And you can see the statistic at the bottom. It says even with less than 10,000 records, the average cost was about $4.9 million. I don't know if I completely agree with that. Just having dealt with the 10,000 plus minus, breaches, I would say that's on the really high end, and somebody might have been taken advantage of somewhere. But it is costly to any organization, regardless of size or industry or your focus in terms of your organization. We also wanted to, share with you some other statistics around, what are people taking, and what types of information are they taking? It runs the gamut. Show of hands real quick. Healthcare data. Anybody have to deal with that? Yeah. Credit card data. Hopefully you're letting everybody else deal with that. And donor data, obviously, is a really big thing. All of you are probably struggling with that one. Honestly, if you look at these statistics, it's pretty even across the board. It doesn't matter what kind of information you have. You need to figure out how do you keep it private and how do you keep it protected. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today.
Right.
And I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo. He was going to talk a little bit about who's causing these problems for us.
Right. So thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. So we have many causes here. Many of the people causing these problems that Karen was talking about: hacktivism, crime, insider being one of the main ones. And most organizations not being aware that that's actually happening. Espionage, terrorism, warfare. One other threat that I wanted to talk about is also phishing. And phishing is one of those that it's been hitting our organizations very heavily in the last few years. And it involves social engineering of data, where the phishing attacker comes in, and portrays to be somebody else within the organization and is trying to capture data from a naive user, somebody who gets an email, and the email may be thought to be coming from a CEO or the president of the organization requesting certain information, and it looks very legitimate. And the user, who is very afraid of not responding to such email, comes back and simply gives out the information unknowingly. And next thing you know, we have a phishing attack that was successful, and the organization has to deal with it. Something that we have to be really careful about. There's many statistics about this, and as Karen talked about some of the numbers, we have, the last one was the FBI that came out with a statistic where it cost about $246 million through this phishing attack. So it's something that's very critical. That's some big numbers. And we have firms that have reported over 7,800 attacks in 2015, I believe, just alone. So something to really keep in mind. And how do we prevent these phishing attacks? Well, in reality, one of the main ways to do it, and possibly the most effective, is security awareness training. Organizations need to involve their employees into security awareness training, and there are many organizations out there that offer this service where you subscribe to the service and they will be sending emails to the employees. And the email, it's mimicking a phishing attack. And before you go through some training and you realize what are the characteristics of these phishing emails. The sender, if you get somebody sending from the FedEx asking you to log onto their website to update your login information, for instance, and you look at the domain, but really it's not coming from FedEx, so something to look into. Also, bogus URLs. So they say, click on this link and update your information, and let's go back to the FedEx example again. But really, when you hover over that URL, it's not really FedEx. It's going to take you to a completely different site, right, Karen?
Fake site, yeah.
Fake site where it's going to trick you to give out the information. But unless the users were aware of such, there are many naive users that come in and simply click on it. Next thing you know, they've compromised their information. So it's something that's very, very important to understand. So security awareness training is something very key that we highly recommend the organizations to implement. Is not that expensive. There is and Karen may know about more, but there is a service called KnowB4, so literally the know and then BE and then the number 4. If you go to that website, they go through their service plans and how you can implement it within the organization. Okay? So
yeah, and real quick on that,
go ahead.
Ricardo. Somebody sent in a question that says,
Perfect.
do you recommend paying ransom if your records are being held? I'm just going to say a quick no.
Yeah.
You never get them back.
You never get them back, I agree.
They keep them, and you don't know what they're doing with them.
Exactly.
I think it's FireEye right now has come out with some decryption software to actually hack the hackers. So they're now having the ability to break ransomware, which is pretty significant. So, no, it's one of those things that you definitely gotta consider twice. Although I've seen some organizations, because as this ransomware has become very popular over the last few years and months, literally, some organizations have gone as far as setting up their own Bitcoin accounts, because clearly a lot of these ransomware attackers want to be paid through Bitcoin. So they want to come in and say, well, as opposed to waiting months or whatever, we want to set this up and pay. But I agree with Karen, that's probably the last resort, and you got to really identify what kind of information are they holding. Is it critical? Can we recuperate it on a timely basis? What are the impacts of not getting this information back from the ransomware attack? And some of the organizations we work with have such sensitive information because they have either political ties or healthcare information or something so important that you would not want it getting out. So that's where your crisis managers come in to help you figure out how are you going to manage the PR around this if this information did get released. But more importantly, and we're going to get to this a little bit about taking some steps to hopefully, I'm not going to say 100% prevent. Years ago, I used to be able to say, we're going to help you with your IT security, and nothing bad's going to happen. Now I say, look, we're going to give you the best steps, and little bit of a Hail Mary and you're going to be good. But
Correct.
there's always that risk now.
So yeah, we have all these cyber threats today, as Karen brought it up, and I brought it up. I wanted to focus more on the phishing because I feel we know where, or the slide here portrays where most of these threats are coming in today. The phishing, I think, is one that's really impacting the organization. I know we have the ransomware. We have others that are really impacting our organizations today. But we have some, how can we manage the risks?
Yeah.
That's really the key point of this. I mean, the risk is still going to be there. It's not going to go away. As Karen said, we can't 100% bulletproof an organization, but we can come in and we can figure out where the weak areas are, or is the organization protecting sensitive information the way it needs to be protected, and we look at those things and provide recommendations so that the organization at least can sleep good at night and feel like, okay, I know we're not 100% secured, but at least we have a good set of tools and practices, a good set of policies and procedures, which I'm going to talk about a little later, that will make us sleep at night and at least feel that if there is ever a data breach, nobody's going to come back and say, well, you really didn't do anything about this. You know, did you think that this was going to hit the organization and now you're on the front page of the Washington Post because you've been hit by an attacker? And do you have any recommendations from a professional out there to make sure that you were doing what you're supposed to be doing? So I'll turn it over to managing risks for Karen, and she's going to bring some of this stuff up on how can we manage these risks.
Yeah, and I think, one of the biggest things is awareness within your organization, and Ricardo touched on that a little bit, and we like to take the approach, and we're finding more and more with the not-for-profit organizations that you're faced with the same types of risks that any organization is faced with. You have internet connectivity, you have people managing your data outside, you have people managing your data internally. You're sharing information with vendors across the board. So you have the same kinds of risks, and in certain ways that, certain organizations we've been working with, we say, okay, what are the lowest hanging fruit? And some of this kind of gets into the financial fraud as well, because we're finding that as we kind of map the business process, we say, well, you have an internal risk here because you have either a single point of failure or you have the single point of failure, which very well could be giving somebody the opportunity to create a ghost vendor, ghost employee, whatever the case may be. So, but you also have the cyber risk when we're mapping the business, and we say, well, somebody could come in from this way, or your vendor is managing your data. So we like to look at the organization across the board, and that's something that traditionally in the past, IT was IT. It's now become an organizational initiative where you need to have all of your technology pieces to ensure you can respond and manage, but you also need to be ensuring that you're complying because you might have some state and federal rules or regulations that you need to follow or guidelines. And then also, how do you govern it over a long period of time? And so Ricardo was going to talk a little bit about how do you get into the policies and procedures and updates. And do any of those questions apply?
So I mean, we have one that maybe we can answer right now. It says, what are some safeguards to limit internal attacks?
Yeah. So we've mentioned it now. This will be the third time. One is education. Also, you have to make sure people know you're watching, that you actually understand that Sally and John are the only two people who have access to that information, and that if there is an issue with that information, that you're going to point the finger at them or be able to trace it back. You should also become a little familiar with forensics and what you can find, and the ability to uncover activities of what your employees are doing is extremely important. Even, a cyber attack, something from the outside, sometimes can be tied to employees. I had a situation with a not-for-profit not too long ago. One of our audit clients called, and my partner called me and said, hey, there's the IT guy that we're going to fire at this company. He's dating the HR manager. Oh, it gets better. The HR manager was just fired 3 weeks ago, and we think he's created backdoors into our environment. And we said, that's fun. How did that happen? Well, he's the only one who has all the passwords for everything.
Right. Yeah.
So we were like, all right, first we're going to change that, end all the passwords. So it's being diligent and understanding. That's what the moral of that story is you can't have just one person managing all this information about your network, managing where the critical information sits. If you have credit card information, my goodness, don't print it out. Don't sit it on a desk, because anybody can pick it up within the organization, take it home and say, you know what, now I have name, address, phone number, credit card number, maybe even social somewhere in there. I also think that you have to be careful with your vendors. And I know it doesn't tie to your insiders as much, but your vendors are a very big weakness, and especially for not-for-profits at this point, because there's so many new donor applications. You have to do your homework and make sure that they actually are as secure as what they're saying.
Correct. No, there's another one that I feel we can tackle right now. Is there any hope IT security will get easier with wider adoption of data encryption and other infrastructure changes? I could probably, answer that. Is it going to get easier? Yeah, hopefully that's the case, but also technology is advancing very rapidly. So as technology advances rapidly and we implement encryption, security, and other risk management techniques, also we need to be moving fast-paced with all the technology that's being implemented, because, as I will talk about it in a little later on the Internet of Things, things are changing so rapidly that hackers are sometimes a step ahead of us implementing risk management techniques. So we have to be very careful. But we hope that by doing this, at least we can do a good overall protection of the organization with the risk that we know of at this point, at least.
No, that's a great point. And actually that segues nicely into the policies and procedures.
Into the policies and procedures, exactly, which I'm going to talk about right now. So most people, obviously in the finance here, as many of our audience is from, it's aware of a policy and procedure. They provide mechanisms and they help us be consistent on the expectations that the employees of the organization have. All the stuff is being held by the policies and procedures. The benefits, they ensure that all the stuff is aware of what's doable versus non-doable, what's allowed, what's not allowed. It's on the policies and procedures manual. Somebody can look at it and figure out, okay, I'm able to do this with my laptop, with my computer, or what have you. So that's very important. It also, it's proven a way to help the managers and supervisors make consistent and reliable decisions. Because sometimes many things come across the board that we don't know how to respond or how to react or how to tackle a certain situation or problem. And that's when, if the organization has a formal IT policy and procedure in place, they can go to it and at least get an idea of how they should go about a particular instance or problem. And I have a good template of sample IT policies and procedures, and I'm sure Karen has too, where we can share with anybody who sends us an email, and we can definitely share on that. I'll give you any organization that does not have a formal IT policy and procedure in place. That's something that at least you could get started with. You could at least look at it and say, all right, and obviously, it depends on the size of the organization. The more IT dependent the organization is, the more robust I would expect the IT policy and procedure to be, of course, because that's what they have.
The startup organizations are where you only have 8 people at this point, and you're going to grow to 100 people or 200 people in the next year or two. You want to get those policies in place before you start hiring all of these employees, because that's where you end up having the churn in the early days, and you want to make sure that they understand how they have to protect your information.
Correct. So it brings long-term benefits to the organization. It also shows the professionalism of the organization. If we come in and do an IT risk assessment for a particular organization and we ask, show me your formal IT policies and procedures, and they look at us like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're saying. Then, clearly right there we have a lack of maybe careness. Maybe it's a little careness situation with the organization, unaware. Obviously, they don't know that there is such thing as formal IT policies and procedures. What are some of the contents of these formal IT policies and procedures? Well, we have hardware purchasing policies, for instance, software purchasing policies. What software can we buy and implement within the organization? How about the use of the software? What kind of software is being usable within the organization? Website policy. Are we allowing our employees to go to certain websites? Use of social media.
I have,
and on and on.
So I have one story on that one. So a lot of organizations don't block websites, which is pretty common because people use the internet for research quite a bit. So I got a call one day, and there was an employee, and it was not a not-for-profit. And they said, look, we think we had an incident. There was an employee who was helping her friend find an apartment, and she went to Craigslist. She didn't really go to Craigslist. Well, then something flashed up on her screen and said, call this 800 number. They had a very established incident reporting, like IT, if you have an IT issue. So she calls the 800 number, not realizing it's not her organization, talks to the guy for 30 minutes, lets him access her computer. Next thing you know, they're sitting on the network. So this was something that could have been avoided.
Right.
We actually gave her a little lecture after the fact and said, what have we learned? And she said, well, maybe I shouldn't help my friends while I'm at work. It's like, wow. Okay, we'll talk with you about other things. But in any event, they ended up having an elaborate investigation because where what she had access to was the credit card information. And they were able to get to that database. Now, it did not appear that anything was taken, but we have other incidents where, the perpetrators are sitting there for a month, 2 months, 6 months, and you don't even know it. And they're sitting on your network, literally watching the emails. And that's how some of the phishing scams start. Correct. Is they get into your network in one way, and they sit there and they watch and they go, hey, we know Ricardo is going to be traveling. Mr. CEO over here, I'm going to send a spoofed email to the CFO and say, we're approving $100,000, $200,000 for this vendor immediately. You need to pay it. A lot of people fall victim to that. And so the service that Ricardo was mentioning is a great service because you can actually test to see if your employees will fall for that. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. That's good. So yeah, it's again, the formal policies and procedures, very important, something that every single organization, no matter how big or small, I think they should implement in accordance to their needs and again, their IT dependence that they have. Some of our nonprofits really depend heavily on processing credit card information. What are we doing about that? Are we, if we're using a third-party provider, are we obtaining the SAS 16 report? Are we looking at independent tests that are being run through these credit card processing companies? So all of this stuff should really be detailed out in their formal IT policies and procedures. We're going to contract with a third-party vendor to perform a certain process for us in the IT sector. Okay, so then what does the policy say about vetting this vendor and feeling comfortable that they're going to be able to protect our data, which is probably going to be sensitive in some nature.
And that's a great segue into managing cloud and mobile risks. Because many of you have donor apps now. You have other types of apps that you can use to run your business. And there's a lot of new ones that constantly pop up. I was doing a session for a not-for-profit seminar about a month and a half ago, and we listed just the donor apps that were literally on the market for the last 6 months that just had come out, and there was like 9 of them. And I'm like, how do you even keep up? So you have to look at the contracts, first of all. You also want to make sure that if they're, obviously collecting credit card information for you or keeping personal information, make sure that they actually have and follow the PCI standards, that they actually have an audit done or a vulnerability, all the penetration testing, that make sure they're secure. Because, and someone actually just told me after the last session, she said, our vendor was breached and we were held liable. Doesn't make sense, but they said, well, we had to sign the contract because they won't negotiate terms. And I said, well, personally, from our organization, we say, no, you're going to meet certain terms. You can all do this as well. If there are certain terms you need to have that are going to provide better protection or that work with your insurance policies, you want to make sure that, and vendor contract review is one of the hottest areas right now because a lot of them are so old. So if you do have these older contracts or newer contracts even, you want to make sure they're consistent from a legal readiness perspective, a retention perspective. How long are they keeping this data? Are they masking it, anonymizing it? How well are they protecting it?
Yeah.
What's the privacy standards? So
Can we get it back if we decide to not continue using them as the third-party service
Yes.
provider? So these SLAs or service level agreements, very important to be reviewing at least every year as you contract with these third service providers, because we need to make sure that we don't get hit by surprises if we decide not to contract with them anymore and they all of a sudden are holding our data hostage.
we had a vendor actually trying to tell our client it was going to cost them over $1 million just to get their data out. Now, it was a lot of data, but there's a lawsuit going on because of it.
Totally.
But those are the kinds of things that are happening is it's not ransomware, but they're holding your data hostage. So
Yeah.
you have to make sure you still have ownership of that information that they're storing for you.
Let's tackle maybe a couple questions here,
Sure.
Karen, before we move on. One that's had a couple votes here. What are your thoughts about penetration tests by third parties? And again, this goes with the third-party service providers anyways. Is this effective or cost prohibitive? Does it obstruct business? I'm going to take the first shot at this. It does obstruct business, of course, and it depends. There are many levels of penetration tests. There is a full-blown one where they halt the entire organization and they say, okay, we're going to go deep in, literally. And they just, obviously everybody's aware and they know that this is happening, but that causes the data to not be flowing and the organization to come to a complete halt. Walmart, I'm going to bring Walmart as an example. They obviously have data centers all over because they need to manage their data centers, and they got mirrored servers all over, data centers all over. So they're able to at least say, okay, we're going to do penetration tests on this particular data center, but it's not going to halt our business because we're going to now move all that data to another data center, and we're going to continue as if nothing is happening. Well, that's an organization with a lot of resources to be able to do such thing. I can tell you, and Karen can agree with me, I hope, that penetration tests are not cheap. They're very expensive. So, any thoughts on everything else?
I'm with you. I mean, is it for third party?
Third party, yep.
Okay, yeah. I think
Tests by third parties. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you have to look at the whole picture.
That's
What
true.
are you storing? What do you have to protect?
Is it beneficial? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the websites, I can see, if you're running a website and you're managing it internally, or your vendor is managing it and they haven't done any testing on it, that's where I would spend my time and effort, because you obviously don't want someone taking your website over. It could be so damaging for your reputation that it's detrimental. But penetration testing for most networks at this point, the vulnerability assessments and IT controls, they're all picking up the low-hanging fruit. I mean, going back to a previous slide, if your IT folks are not updating the patches or the software updates, that can be really detrimental. And I've actually seen where there were hundreds of thousands of healthcare records breached because the IT guy was like, well, I didn't feel like doing it this week. Yeah, I waited. Yeah, and we said, well, you're fired.
Yeah, and it's so sad to see a lot of IT professionals be more on the reactive as opposed to the proactive approach, which again, everything is running fine, then I don't need to do anything here.
Yeah.
So we had an engagement where that was the case, and the IT director who was handling all these organizations' IT infrastructure was literally changing settings as we were doing our IT risk assessment. Oh, the firewall, okay. Oh, I got to change this. Oh, I got to change that. So literally the president of the organization said, I never got so many questions from my IT director until a week before you guys came over and showed up to our office. So it shows you. But let me go to another question here, which has gotten a few votes here. In your opinions, is cyber insurance worth the cost? So if yes, what do you get? What do you see as the main risk that we would transfer by buying the insurance?
So you should have come to the 9 o'clock session on ERM. I'm not sure where the question is coming from, but Will Ohm from Kilpatrick, Townsend and Stockton was on a panel with me, and he's actually a cyber insurance expert. He hates the phrase cyber insurance, but I say it anyway. And so one of the things I've learned from him is, you get insurance to further protect your organization, but you need to understand what is in it. There are organizations like BDO and Ricardo's that come in and help you figure out what value do you need around cyber insurance, which elements do you need. Brokers, as we know, will sell you anything, tell you anything. So, speaking with either outside counsel that specializes in that area, or speaking with forensic and insurance recovery folks who can do the valuation to figure out, well, our organization has this much to protect.
Right.
This is the type of policy and what should be in it. You also need to look at your D&O plans, your E&O plans, your GL plans. I mean, you need to look at the whole picture as you're doing that, because there might be some of these elements around computer fraud covered. And yes, I did learn all this from Will, so I have to thank him. But it is really important, and it is really difficult to figure out, because now everybody is selling cyber insurance. It's it's a fairly new product. It's only been around about 6-7 years, I think, maybe 8 years. The one thing I can tell you, though, from personal experience and partnering with some of the insurance companies, is you want to look at what preventative information or actions or steps they'll help you take. So some of them will give you kind of a free access to training for your employees. So, around data privacy and protection. So you don't have to go out and buy something else. Some will give you, most of them have panels of experts where they're either doing the incident response for you, or they're the lawyers, and they're pre-negotiated rates. So those are little things you can look for. I personally think you have to look at your organization and what are you trying to protect. If, and again, even if you're outsourcing everything, you still have to consider, what do we have to...
Exactly.
What impact does our vendor have on us?
And the appropriateness of those SLAs that we talked about earlier. But I agree with Karen. It's one thing that you have to look at holistically. You have to look at the entire picture, and definitely not go just by what the insurance broker is telling you, and not go by what the IT department is telling you that needs to be protected, because sometimes you get a policy just by what the IT department says needs to be protected, and you get that policy, and next thing you know, you're not fully protected, or you're overprotected. So I think you need to get various people involved on what kind of insurance, and that's obviously what Karen was alluding to. And this one is in relation to the cloud, which goes right into what we have here. Where did it go? I think I had it over here. Okay, what are some companies you recommend for cloud storage of documents, especially clients whom don't have their own private server network?
They're asking for recommendations
of cloud companies to help store.
That's all you.
One thing I gotta say to that, I don't have any specific companies. I mean, we use our own companies, but one thing that we are always looking out for is, where is the data stored? Because we don't want, in our own perspective, we don't want our data to be sitting outside of the boundaries of the United States. So we need to come in and get that assurance from the company that their servers are all located within the United States because of the Privacy Act, I believe.
Well, GDPR, that'll be rolled out May 25th, 2018.
Exactly.
So could be an impact there.
But, there was many companies out there that obviously offer this particular service. I would say that's one thing that we look for. And another thing that you want to look for is, you wanna see if they are being tested. Do they have a service audit being done, a SAS 16 audit report? And if that's the case, you may want to look at that to make sure that you're contracting with them.
And can they support HIPAA compliance,
right,
or PCI compliance?
PCI.
Do you want a managed service, or where they do everything, or do you want to actually just physically put stuff in their location and you manage it? So I think there's a lot that goes into that, and there are checklists about choosing cloud providers for data storage. It's out there. And a lot of the reputable providers have information on their sites, so you can kind of compare across all of them.
Correct.
But it is a daunting task, needless to say.
It's a daunting task.
You brought up a good point about within the U.S., and we see that from a litigation perspective, where that can be problematic. If you have to respond to a discovery request, you want to make sure that your data is in a country where you don't have to worry about certain privacy rules. The other thing with GDPR, are there any global organizations here? Anybody dealing with that? No? Okay. Yeah, so GDPR is the new EU data directive that'll be rolled out next year, just so you know what it is, in case you're thinking about expanding globally. But that's all around privacy, data privacy, and the handling of personal information.
Here's one that, before we move on, and then we'll move on to the next topic because of the lack of time here, but if we establish, since we're still in the IT policies and procedures, if we establish IT policies and procedures written, who should be the owner of those policies, procedures to ensure that they're complied with? Great question.
That's a good question.
That's a very good question. Now, policies and procedures need to be developed not just internally by management. Governance also needs to be involved in the development of those IT policies and procedures, because they also know the strategic direction of the organization. What kind of data are we handling? What kind of risks do we have? So it's a combined effort, but yes, there's got to be somebody within the organization that takes ownership and takes responsibility of these policies and procedures. And for the big organizations, that's easy, because usually they have a certified information security officer, or CISO, could be one person that's owning these particular policies and procedures and is constantly looking at them and changing them and discussing them with governance and also with the rest of management and the finance team and everybody else. If the organization is not big enough to support such position within, then it probably goes back to the IT director as another option. It could be the CFO if that person is acting in that active capacity. So there's many options, but the key point is to really pinpoint somebody, as Karen said before, that you can point your fingers at and say, well, this is your responsibility.
Hold them accountable.
Exactly. Whom can we hold accountable? But it's very important to understand that governance needs to be involved in the development of these policies and procedures. Management cannot just come in and say, here they are, and then randomly just apply them and implement them. So very important that we involve governance in this whole process.
Yeah, one of the things we've been doing around who owns the policies is splitting up the responsibility more than we ever used to. It used to be IT owned all of this stuff, but you know, God forbid you suffer a serious security event that causes a data breach or some other type of issue. IT, what are they going to do? They're going to go back and say, no, we didn't create that issue. So we've been separating it out. If you have, in some cases, depending upon, you know, as Ricardo mentioned, the size of your organization will dictate who owns what. So CFOs are taking on, finance is taking on a lot of responsibility. If you also hold the internal audit function, you're taking on a lot of responsibility in those areas to say, hey, these are the policies, we own them, IT implements them, security checks them, and we're even putting security outside of IT groups for quite a few years now, because if they're reporting into IT, they kind of feel an alliance. Mm-hmm. And so we're finding that by having the CFO or the finance organization or the legal organization take on responsibility for security and then ownership of some policies, you know, either through legal or finance, we're finding that there's a little bit of separation of church and state more than there used to be, so you can't hide as much. But you do have to be well enough versed mm-hmm. about what you're saying goes into a policy. And we actually, you know, in terms of managing risks, we had, this is a framework we used for kind of a unified information governance, and it's not showing up the best on the screen, but ultimately you can see in the middle, everyone is responsible for the protection and privacy of your data, your donor's data, your customer data, whatever it may be, patient data. And using a mechanism like this, it lets you look at across the board of saying, okay, what are our goals or drivers, and what results do we want to see? So you can take this and customize it for your organization mm-hmm. and then say, all right, well, now how are we going to split out the duties?
Right.
So.
And thing about managing risks is we have to manage risk, we need to understand what we're protecting. We need to know the assets that we're protecting. So it's very important that the organizations take an inventory of their assets, digital assets, to figure out what we need to protect and who owns those assets. Mm-hmm. Who has access to that data, to that information that may be sensitive or may not be sensitive. So it's important that the organization understands that, because data that's more sensitive in nature and it's more business critical, we want to focus or attention to it more so than data that's probably not so much. So that's why it's important that organizations go through their data, go through everything that they have an inventory of such data, and really categorize that inventory
Yes.
in terms of importance to the organization. If we really lose this data over here, we're not going to be in business within 24 hours. So it's very important as we apply the managing risk that we understand what we're trying to protect and how we're going to protect it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm going to go through maybe 2 more questions and
Sure,
then
go
we'll
right
go
ahead.
to the next one. What do you recommend for small organizations with one person who has administrative rights for software? Let you handle that one.
Oh, thanks. Personally, I just don't think it should always be one person.
Yeah.
You think about the old adage of what happens if I get hit by a bus. So you don't want the keys to the kingdom under one person. Now, what you don't want to do is send an email in plain text with all the passwords to somebody else, because that can be detrimental as well. So you do, and I'm not a big fan personally of the apps that will let you save all your passwords. I think that is one of the worst ideas I've ever seen. I don't write a single password down, but you can have multiple administrative accounts. And so, you obviously, for a small organization, you still want to be auditing what are these people actually doing with the software. Yes, sir.
What do you advise on best practices for password management?
Yeah, I still haven't come up with a great idea. So personally, I think everybody has to have an account. So I have my own password, and it's up to that person to use a strong enough password that you can remember. So it's not something like.
Good luck.
All right, I'll give you a little tip. Pick your favorite thing to do or your favorite sports team. Add a capital letter. Mix in some numbers that are maybe your PIN, so you're not going to forget the word. Sports teams are great for this, or pets. Where you can put, so I have a dog named Rocco, and it's ROCCO. And so.
Oh, now you can access her accounts.
Yeah. I don't use my pet's names. But so if I wanted to do something like this, and this is a best practice, is adding in special characters, numbers, capital letters. Yeah. But managing it.
But managing gazillion passwords, because everything has a
Right.
Yeah. So is there some encrypted,
There is encrypted services out there. I know you're not a big fan of them.
Yeah.
But that's one of the easy ways.
What about just on your encrypted, if your laptop is encrypted and you could encrypt it at the file level, could you keep one file?
You could.
I mean, because it's going to take somebody, 9,000 years to crack that
9,000
anyway.
years. I guess if they have a strong enough computer, they could probably crack it much faster than that. Now,
Yeah.
one thing also in terms of the password guidelines is I've seen some people and organizations implement, they have complicated passwords, but they associate the passwords with either the task or the site or whatever process you're trying to access.
But he wants to know if he has 15 of them or 100 or whatever it is, how do you... Does anybody else have any suggestions? Because we're at a loss.
Aren't there some of these encryption?
Yeah, there's
like LastPass?
Yeah.
LastPass
Yeah,
is the
there's
one that I'm
those.
aware of. Yeah, the LastPass is the one that I'm aware of, and that I personally actually use it.
There.
Yeah, I use it, and it's very useful. I use it on my cell phone.
Every one of their employees to use it.
Right. And you could decide. It's
Right.
got really strong features that you can isolate passwords. You could tell people, okay, I want these people to have access to this particular set of passwords, but I don't want these other people to know those passwords. So you can really create a good isolation within the system that you're managing your passwords very accurately. So that's one that I actually, as I was with one of the certified information systems auditors through AICPA, this professional recommended LastPass, and he uses it personally, and he creates very nice passwords that you will never remember, as you probably know. So
There we go. Okay. You said you had... Do we want to cover another question?
there's one right there.
I use a phrase that I associate with whatever that website is,
Right.
and then for certain letters, I always use.
Oh.
So like, I love my husband, or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The O is the number.
It's 0, yeah.
E is
Yeah.
3 or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would
Right.
and put numbers in.
Yep.
And, they get special characters they allow.
Yeah, and I guess I think to your point over here, it might be more so if you have 5 people who have to know the passwords more than just yourself, or...
Or, there's recommendations that you don't use the same password for different things. And that's so that means you're going to have a gazillion.
Yeah, so that one I'm not sold on. If your password is strong enough and you can do some iteration of that every 90 days or 120 days, personally, I think you can keep reusing a good portion of it and changing one character because it will trip anybody up. And, having done decryption on devices that we didn't know whether we were going to be able to get into, even the simplest of devices, believe it or not, even weak passwords take a while to get through. So I don't know if I'd be using, a different password for everything. I know it's recommended, but is it realistic?
Is it realistic? Yeah.
But and it also depends if you're managing really sensitive stuff. Then yeah, you probably want to take those steps.
Then besides the password, you may want to go to a 2-factor authentication.
Yeah.
Where not only are you required to have the password, but you also have to have something else. And usually they send a text message to your cell phone or another email that you need to have access to where they provide you with a code. So besides having the password, you need to have another piece of information. One thing that was very clever through this organization is they did it based on location. So they were able to read, if you were using your cell phone, where you were, and they could basically dictate whether or not you would have access to a certain website or what have you because of your location. So obviously if you have somebody from overseas trying to access something that they're not supposed to be accessing, the system will automatically detect it, and even though they knew the password, it would shut them down. So really strong security features right there that I think would be worth exploring. But again, it depends on the data because this gets expensive. Yeah. So it depends on the data that you're trying to protect and the site that you're trying to access, Going on a little bit on this one, and then we'll move on. I keep saying that, but these questions are really good anyways, that I figured out we want to please our audience, right? How do you make sure that your IT person is keeping the software current?
That's more you.
Yeah, I guess that's me then, I guess. Okay.
I'm going to pass
Well, I'll pitch into that one here. I think it's very important to, again, go back to have a strong inventory. First of all, you got to know what software you have. Number one.
That's a challenge.
That's a challenge because a lot of organizations, it's how many applications, how many people here think they're using 10 applications within your organization? Just raise your hand. Okay. How about between 10 and 20?
Only 10.
Only 10 or less. Let's say 10 or less. Okay, that's good. How about 10 and 50? Between 10 and 50. Okay. Okay, and more than 50. All right, interesting. So, and this doesn't just apply to software. It also applies to firmware for particular devices like printers, for instance, or routers or firewalls that are hardware devices. They also have software embedded in them that needs to be patched, that needs to be updated, because otherwise that's a leak into the network if those are not properly patched. So again, we go back to having a strong inventory of assets, and that includes software, that includes hardware. And again, as we said with the IT policies and procedures, we really need to have somebody accountable and have them manage that particular inventory to make sure that the patches are properly updated, and more importantly, tested before they're applied. Because many times, and Karen probably, then I'll turn it over to Karen, but there's a lot of IT professionals out there that simply think, oh, an IT patch just came out, I'm just going to install it because that's what the manufacturer says. Done. And the next thing you know, the network is down for like 2 days.
It breaks something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So very important to test it somewhere before you actually apply these patches. But I think you need to really pinpoint somebody and delegate this to somebody to keep track of the inventory and to be able to apply these patches in a responsible manner.
Well, and personally, I think it comes down to communication. So often I hear about, the IT team is like, oh, well, nobody talks to us. or, or somebody else says, from legal or finance or in the business says, we never know what IT does. That's like a black box over there.
Yeah.
So, if you have somebody who's keeping the inventory outside of IT and that says we want an inventory of all the applications and hardware, then, that person should be saying, all right, what updates are coming out, for our highest risk areas. If you have more than 50 applications, it's going to be really difficult to keep track of what IT is doing. You have to focus on the high risk areas. And so if 5 of those applications manage critical data for you, keep an eye on those first, then worry about the other ones. So you kind of, and while anybody can get in through any type of software pretty much, it still at least gives you a focus, over time. There's a lot of questions
and this relates to, we'll move on after I say this on our slides because I know we got a couple to cover, but this also relates into the financial statement audit. We're coming in as auditors and we're trying to understand the IT controls in respect to the IT infrastructure of the organization. So a lack of patch applying or keeping software up to date, that might stem a material weakness within your management letters simply because of the risk of material misstatement. If the network goes down and now we cannot produce financial statements, that's a high risk of material misstatement right there. So we as auditors are coming in and we're inspecting, at least inquiring and talking to the IT professionals and trying to find out if the proper policies and procedures are in place to make sure that the organizations are at least safeguarding their assets in a proper way to be able to produce financial statements.
Yeah. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit because you actually covered a lot of the managing vendor risks.
Yep.
And, I think we've talked quite a bit about vendor management. So moving into planning to respond, well, the proactive pieces and the response pieces kind of go hand in hand. You need to do as much planning as you can before something does happen. And, one of the steps we say is we'll develop the governance framework. And maybe you can talk a little bit about governance and what that really looks like.
Right. So as I alluded to these earlier in terms of governance, they're the ones that have a clear strategic vision of the organization. So it's important that they are involved in developing, back to the IT policies and procedures, in developing, okay, what kind of safeguards do we need to implement within the organization? What kind of policies do we need to implement? Are we securing the data appropriately?
What if you're not large enough to have a governance team or even a compliance team? Who owns that then? Is it finance? Is it?
Obviously, all organizations hopefully have a governance team. The board of directors would be considered sort of like their governance team. So there would be somebody there hopefully will take a little bit of a proactive approach and some involvement in terms of the IT governance and the framework. And there's many framework samples that could be followed. The NIST obviously has some. COVID, which is given by AICPA, has some examples too. So there's some good samples to follow to make sure that we get a proper framework implemented within the organization. It doesn't have to be as complex. If the organization doesn't have a strong IT dependence, obviously, then you don't need to go as deep. But I would say if you're dealing with a lot of IT and your organization depends a lot on it, you probably need to dive a little deeper, and it might be considered by the organization to have in their board of directors somebody who's probably knowledgeable about
Well, and it's
IT.
looking at your board of directors and saying, okay, does anybody know about security? Does anybody know about IT?
What's the awareness at the governance level? Because sometimes, and that's starting to change as we go through, as organizations are being impacted by attacks, where the governance is now becoming more like, okay, well, we really got to do something here. And what are we doing about it?
Well, and one of the other things, the second thing we really mention now is focus on data privacy. Your employee records are extremely critical to protect. You want to look at credit card information, healthcare information. All of those things are really important to protect. One of the most overlooked areas is when you're holding sensitive information, the privacy around how do I actually protect it? Well, one thing is anonymizing it. So data masking techniques where yeah, you have the just the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, but you're not really, nobody can see, it's not in plain text, the other 5 digits. So using software and techniques like that, and you know, everyone must have some level of security practices going on in their organization. So talk to your vendors about, well, how do we know this is secure and protected? You know, making sure that within the organization, your employees understand how to protect information. Again, I go back to one of the simplest things in the world because I've seen people leave mobile phones in cabs with healthcare records on it, USB devices in cabs with healthcare records on it, laptops in cabs unencrypted with healthcare records on it. I mean, it runs the gamut. A list of all our patients, hard copy, on paper, left in a cab. I don't know what patient records were on it. Well, where'd you get it? Well, I printed it from my computer. Well, where's that file? Well, I don't know. And we're like, how did that happen? Oh, I sent it to, you know, John. He has it. John doesn't have it. So, you know, we've seen crazy things happen, and it's simple stuff. So I think personally, communications, awareness, education is still one of the best things you can do within your organization to make sure that everyone has a respect for the data privacy.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
Looks like we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we have one here that I think will probably, it's worth, and by the way, everybody will have our email address at the end of the session. Probably we'll give it out so that everybody can access and ask us, and we'll be able to send these templates for the
I think this is already shared. Well,
it's already probably on there, but we'll make sure that everybody has that. And if you don't, just come up after the session, and we'll give it to everybody. But would you encourage company-provided equipment or BYOD? Bring your own device. And this will take us to the next question anyways, and a little bit about this whole thing. And I want to, let me dive into this one and
sure,
pitch in anyway. So there's a lot of risks, obviously, with the BYOD. Now, it's tough to really just go one-sided and not allow the BYOD, right? Because for God's sake, we're all using our own cell phones within our organizations to correspond with clients. I think it's also awareness. How are these devices being utilized? Are they properly encrypted when they leave our organization? What kind of transactions are we doing within those devices? Is anything sensitive in nature when we're sending back an email to a client and we decided to attach something and I'm doing it on my cell phone? What kind of information am I attaching? Or what kind of information am I emailing back and forth with this particular client or organization or whatever you happen to be corresponding to? Because that awareness is key. There's a lot of sniffers literally probably out here. They probably know there was over 1,200 people and in the finance department here that probably a lot of sensitive emails are going through right now within this building, that they probably are sitting outside thinking, how can I get into this person's email and what kind of information? So if you are aware, if people are aware of what they're doing within their mobile devices, yeah, they might hack into your device, but if you're not really handling sensitive information, there's really nothing to lose. So awareness is very key. There's a lot of risks, obviously. The sniffers, as I talked about, stealing, you know, the device being stolen unencrypted, being lost unencrypted, and so on and so forth. Now, there is also the issue about connecting mobile devices or bring your own device into our network. I bring in my cell phone or I bring in my own laptop and that happened to be infected. It has a virus. I connect it to the network and next thing you know, it just took the whole network down because there was no security in terms of like how are we scanning that particular device. Now, one thing that I came across and that I know about is the network access control. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's a particular service that organizations, and probably more on the robust side of things, you may want to consider implementing it, but it's, you know, it's a technique for network management to implement security within the network. The network access controls literally is scanning constantly what's connected to the network at any point in time, whether people or devices, right?
And there's a lot of, I mean, SolarWinds has some online capabilities to show who's accessing what and how they're connecting stuff. And
exactly.
So
Cisco TrustSec is another one. So there's many services out there that provide this network access control. It also provides for something that Karen already alluded to, audit logs. We need to make sure that what are people doing within the network,
Yep.
and are we keeping track of it? Because that way we can hold people accountable for things that are being done within our network. Changes are being done to some settings on our Active Directory, and if we don't have an audit log, we have no idea who did it and why.
Yeah.
So very important to really keep track of that. And that obviously covers our BYOD threats, which are some of the ones that we talked about. A BYOD, a cell phone coming in with a virus. This will scan it. One of the threats also is bringing in a laptop that doesn't have an antivirus software installed in it. This NAC system will scan those particular devices and will not allow access to the network once it detects that it's not configured in accordance to network standards, your organization standards, which again are set up by IT policies and procedures, and you can see how everything just builds onto each other. Mm-hmm. So when it's implemented correctly, it can definitely help the organization feel more in control of its network.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Karen. Turn it over to you.
No. Go ahead. Did you have another question?
Let's see right here. If we have any others
it's a long
here.
list of questions. Which is great.
I'm going with the ones that are getting the most votes, everyone. So we'll try to tackle as many as we can here. But here's one. Due to the increasing cost of maintaining IT infrastructure and security, are smaller NFPs better off moving most or all of their IT systems to the cloud with reputable third-party providers?
I mean, the cost is starting to outweigh the benefit of trying to manage it yourself. So it's becoming apparent that if you can go with the reputable providers, that it does make a lot of sense to really consider moving a lot of this stuff outside. And their business is to manage systems and data, which that is not your business. So, or most of you, it's probably not your business. So I kind of look at it this way, is if Amazon is in the business of storing data, hosting applications, and managing and protecting it, they're going to do it a lot better than I am. Now, I'm not going to say they're never going to be breached, because then you have the flip side of that of, well, they're more of a target. So again, it's what kind of data do you have, what kind of applications, what kind of sensitive information do you have to really make that decision. And it's organization independent. It's dependent on your organization. It doesn't matter if you're for-profit, not-for-profit. You need to look at your organization and does the cost outweigh the risk?
Totally agree.
And the benefits.
Yep.
And in that same vein, this was in your packet. If you don't have an incident handling methodology or process, and I've spent a fair amount of my career in
disaster recovery plans and all that stuff.
Well, not DR plans. I mean, investigations.
Yeah, investigations.
Like figuring out
Forensic.
who the culprit was, who did it, why did they do? Well, how did they do it, and what did they get? And one of the things we see mostly with not-for-profits is you're just starting to think about incident handling and how do we, even if it's not a data breach, but we don't know for sure, how do I handle that event? And at the end of the day, you have to make sure that either your internal team can handle it or you have some trusted advisors on the outside. And that could include your cyber insurance. It could include, meaning they'll have a panel of experts for you. It could mean outside counsel helping you, because there's people called data breach coaches and there's a lot of data privacy attorneys. It's forensic examiners, incident responders, cyber investigations, and there's a lot of tools and templates out there, especially from SANS Institute. They have some good policies you can put in place. The one key thing I will tell you is if you think you've had some type of security incident, do not start sending emails to everybody saying, hey, I think we were hacked. I've seen more times than not how IT or finance or somebody in the organization outside of legal sends something that is not protected under privilege, and it really comes, especially if you do have an insurance policy that covers some of this, make sure you understand how you're supposed to communicate. Make sure your employees understand. You don't want, again, Sally, I'm picking on Sally today, but Sally, who works in the front office, you don't want her sending an email and says, yeah, I just went to some website that I don't think really I should have gone to, and I think they got into our network, or, whatever the case may be. So you have to make sure your employees and staff are certainly up to date on this.
Update.
Yeah,
I think we touched on this obviously already.
We beat this like a dead horse.
You know?
And then we've talked a lot about communications
We talked
and
about the communication and training, implement holistic cyber risk strategy. So we can tackle a couple more questions here. One thing is, please differentiate between IT policies versus procedures. Well, policies are the rules themselves, and procedures are sort of like the instruction on how to apply those rules. How do we go about applying those rules? So that's the key difference between the two. The policies, we have the rules in place, and the procedures is how do we go about applying those rules. So that's the key differentiator right there.
Good answer.
Let's see, the cost of keeping IT infrastructure and software versions up to date is in a massive backlog in most NFP organizations, and it has not been a funding priority for donors. True. Have any NFP been able to break through to get large donors funding to keep these up to date and as secure as current as possible?
These are questions for you guys. Have you guys had any experience where you've had donors that will actually contribute just to keep your applications up to date, or your IT, or your... It sounds far-reaching to me because I haven't heard.
I mean, I know
delegated.
the federal government is definitely moving in that direction in terms of, at least from the federal funding perspective, and I probably will see that in the future happening eventually, where those organizations that get funds from the federal government, they probably will not give organizations funding unless they prove that they have a strong IT control system in place, especially if they're handling some sensitive information, medical records, or what have you. Those grants are probably going to be, and I would assume that they will embed in those awards some kind of fixed amount to be able to come up with those IT infrastructures that they're looking for.
I mean, one thing I can tell you is the Gates Foundation still does have, I believe you can submit for application for approval to receive certain funding specific to technology for your organization based on what you do.
I think it goes back to communication. I think it's talking to your donors and really letting them understand the need for this extra funding to be able to protect their data. Because in essence, they're also on the hook if their data gets out there. So I think it's more of communication, and hopefully it's something that will start to move in the right direction in terms of donors allowing this particular extra funding right there. Let's see if we have a couple ones here. What are some of the safeguards to limit internal attacks? I think we talked about that. We talked about cyber insurance. This one is uninteresting. The NSA can basically see an ant on the ground from space. So why is it so hard to catch government hackers? Leakers, I mean, government leakers.
I'm not touching that question.
I just wanted to read it. I thought it was interesting. Oh my God, I don't know. That's a good question right there. And
you can
Karen
email Ricardo later if you have that question. If you really want to know, he'll tell you.
Equipment, wise control, you recommend bank. Okay.
You know, one thing in that regard, though, I can tell you is we're actually finding it now easier to track down the hackers than we used to be able to.
That's true.
We used to have to do, I mean, look, we all kind of know where they come from. Most countries, believe it or not, the U.S. is one of the biggest culprits as well, besides China and Russia and the Ukraine. And but now it is funny how it is actually easier for us to track them down than it used to be. So that's a little bit of an answer.
Yeah, that hopefully helps a little bit. And I don't know if you're so much into the banking industry, but what IT controls do you recommend for banking activity?
Well, if you're for banking activity, not a financial institution, but banking activity. You know, to be honest, the strongest guidelines I've seen out there, and even though it's built for financial institutions, is the New York Department of Finance, New York DFS, I think they specifically go by. They've just rolled out a bunch of guidelines and requirements for financial institutions. So if you're thinking about your banking activity and banking information, I would actually start there. And what are they doing in terms of what could you be doing? And it does translate to any type of business. So thinking a little bit about outside of the box, you could probably apply that to your organization?
Right. I think I'm scanning the questions here to make sure that I've covered them all. And the most important ones I think we got. So let me just go here. Bear with me for a second. This thing is freezing.
Are there any
on me.
questions in the audience?
Yeah.
Or are you guys logging in and just sending them?
It seems like everybody's sort of like going in here. Okay.
I didn't know if this session was also a webinar. Oh, okay.
So here's one that maybe we can tackle. We only have like 4 minutes left anyways. What items should be in your BYOD policy? What safeguards do you recommend to be in place to protect data with BYOD? Software to wipe data. Clearly that's important. Obviously, most of the Apple devices, at least you can erase all the information. But again, you have to keep the inventory of those assets.
You have to know what you have.
You have to know what you have. So the NAC that I was talking about, the network access control, helps you come up with that inventory. But if you don't have the ability to implement such thing, you still got to know what you have and who's using what to be able to, if I lose my cell phone or employee over there uses his or her cell phone, do we know that that even happened? And what kind of information is stored in that particular mobile device? So, very important.
I know we've found great success with Mobile Iron and AirWatch and some of those where you can pick and choose parts of the phone that you want to wipe so you're not, especially if you do have a bring your own device policy. I also have clients who say the phone connecting to email is not bring your own device because of, especially if you're using Office 365, it's never really hitting your organization unless you're hosting Office 365 yourself. Most people do it in the cloud. So it's never really going through your network. So technically, they're getting your emails, but those will be gone, within whatever time frame you set up.
Right.
So it really depends, do you have special applications that you need? I'm still a little anymore. It's like if I can't get to that network and the data and the files from my phone, I don't know what I'm really protecting because I can turn their email account off at any time. I mean, granted, if they're going to take something, they're going to take something anyway.
That's true. That's true. I think it's the transfer of data that's happening within those mobile devices, as I talked before. Many applications are coming out in the market where a lot of us can still conduct business from our cell phone. We can do many things through various applications. So what kind of information is being transferred between our cell phone and that particular application or email or whatever we're doing, and how are we doing it to protect it? So again, training, awareness, letting people know, just limit your sensitive information that you're sending through your email, and your activity that you're using through your mobile device or cell phone or tablet. I mean, tablets are highly used right now. So very important to make people aware of such situation to avoid a sniffer out there from intercepting our device and then all of a sudden gaining access to our network. But also, one thing to finish up, and then I'll leave it up to Karen, is...
I said you were going to get to lunch early. It doesn't look like it's happening,
all these questions are coming up. Yeah, I guess we can wrap it up. Let's do it. Let's go to lunch,
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.